Back in January of this year, when it was still cold in the wintertime, my girlfriend's family and I decided to have a weekend bonfire where we sit out, cooked some barbecue chicken, and sat around the fire. Well, after the night grew weary, and my girlfriend's mom and dad and brother all retired to bed, it was just my girl and I, sitting out by the fire, kissing, talking, and just staring off into the night. It was incredibly peaceful and wonderful to every degree, until we heard a horrible, horrible roar that shook us both. This roar is far off in the canyon. On the back side of my girlfriend's father's house is a very, very large canyon that has woods separating the backyard from that canyon. Whatever this roar came from, it didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard of, or I would want to meet. And not only was it loud, but it was incredibly deep. It had such low vibrations. You know how, like, if you've ever played bass and you're playing it through an amp, and when you pluck a note, you could feel the vibrations hitting your body. It was kind of like that. Whatever animal made this sound had to have been of enormous size, and for it to carry out in the canyon like that, the way it did, for as long as it did, disturbed me and my girlfriend. That's another thing. The howl or roar lasted 10 to 15 seconds. It was incredibly loud. It did scare me, but it scared my girlfriend far more, to the point she was shaking, got up, put the fire out, and told me to come on, we're going in the house. And in the house we went. I wasn't going to argue with her. It freaked me out too. I was worried that whatever it was going to come up this way, attracted by the only light surrounding the area, a fire. I'm glad we got out of there, and I didn't have to see what made this noise. At the time, it seemed like any typical disturbance of my cattle. Something had spooked them, and they were running and mooing and carrying on. So I grabbed my shotgun and went outside to take a peek. Come to find out that it was much more than a simple matter of them being spooked. I came across a few of my cows lying on the ground, bleeding out. So that's when I began moving with a purpose, if you get me. Even when it comes to predators like wolves, an adult cow can hold its own pretty well, unless it's sick or injured. So, my mind was working to figure out what could have gotten the best of some of my cows so quickly. I didn't have the time to perform autopsies. I rushed out to where the action was. My small herd was cowering from what looked to be a man. I yelled to it that I was armed and dangerous, and it didn't seem to hear. So I tried to get an angle where none of my cows would take any of the buckshot. Walking around the thing as it was lunging at my cows got me a full picture of what it was that I was exactly up against, and it wasn't pretty. It was just like the pictures you see in some of the pyramids, the ones with the dog god thing. It just wasn't wearing fancy clothes. But it looked every bit like the pointy-faced black dog that walked around on two legs. I think they call it Anubis, but I could be wrong. It appeared to have that really sleek and pointed snout and muzzle. The eyes were wide open and clearly flushed with adrenaline. It slashed at my cows with claws that were very long. I almost wondered how it avoided cutting itself. I finally got to an angle where I could take a shot and see what would happen. The cloud of shot pelted the monster, and fur blew away in a small cloud of blood. That's when I had its attention. Narrow as the head seemed to be, the teeth were long, and I could see just how long because it bared them at me in a special shade of anger. Despite the shock of the wound, it tried to charge me. So, I let it have it with the other barrel. That shit cut deep enough that I could see chinks of bone peeking out. It kept howling, in a horrible pain, but just kept coming. I was doing a number. I still had time to chamber another 2 shells and let them go. The volley shredded most of the meat off of its head, and somehow, the thing kept staggering towards me. I chambered 2 more shells, and ladies and gentlemen, that was all she wrote. Thing was, after that shot, there wasn't anything left to share with the press. I had a skeletal mass of pulp and vaporized tissue. If I reported this, there was a solid chance that it could be misconstrued as a human body. Then, who would look after my cows? I could be facing some serious prison time, and nothing I could say would change that. So, I more or less took the loss of my cows for the sake of my personal freedom. I try to use the slain as much as possible, but there's only so much beef a farming family can eat. Anyway, that's my story. You're free to use it if you'd like. I live outside the incredibly small town of Weaverville in Northern California. Basically, I live in the sticks, and I believe I saw something, some kind of animal, some creature, that I'm not quite sure what it is. I can't explain it, but the only description I can give you is that it resembled that of a Great Dane, except standing up on 2 legs. The only connection I have is when I grew up, I was very close to my aunt. She always had 2 Great Danes with her. My entire upbringing, any time the pair would die, or one would die, she would buy another. It was very odd, so that's always stuck out to me. And what I saw that night closely resembled that exactly of a Great Dane. In fact, I even suspected it at first, and was wondering how weird it was that it was walking around. But on closer inspection, even though it was as large and as tall and lanky, it resembled more of a coyote from what I could tell. Very, very slender. Its legs were a little more muscular than that of a dog's, but still had the hocks and everything. It stared at me from the woodline, kind of glowing red orbs of eyes, but not like monster red. They were just a warm red glow, an unnatural glow at anything. I wasn't really afraid as much as I was confused. It seemed to be watching me very nervously, like it had got caught doing something and was waiting for me to leave. I don't know. It doesn't really make sense, but that's the vibe I got from it. At the time, I was in my backyard splitting firewood when I happened to look up and see this thing staring at me. My backyard isn't the largest, but those trees go on for quite a while. I want to say another 5-6 miles. I could be way off, but I know it's a ways back there. I've only seen this animal once, and this was about 3 months ago, right in the height of summer. I have never seen it since, nor heard of it. I have no idea what it could be. From what I know, it could possibly be some sort of rabid wild dog, although I've never heard of rabid wild dogs around here, and by themselves, and especially ones that look like coyote Great Danes. Hi, what lurks beneath? I absolutely love your channel, and a close friend of mine actually has their own horrifying war story to share that somehow involves these dogmen. I had them type it up and send it to me, and they've given me their full permission for me to send this to you and you to read it. So, feel free to read it to your audience if you'd like. Anyway, I've copied and pasted this story in, so here you go. My battalion was pushing into Al-Qaeda stronghold, which was a little more than a few city blocks of super thick buildings. It was no fortress, but the tactics they used could try the nerves of any soldier. More than once, I saw my men charged by children that had explosives strapped to their backs. If they ran back where they came from, they'd be shot by their captors. If they ran towards my men, they had to decide if they could live with sacrificing a child for the lives of their fellow soldiers. It was a dire time, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. The further we pushed into the stronghold, the more we got to see just how old the quarter of the city was. It seemed to be so old that it was mostly uninhabited, and not just due to the occupation by this group. We managed to get by what we had thought was an established perimeter. We found it completely left open, with no security whatsoever. Very sloppy compared to what we usually got from them. We went down a dark alleyway that was so narrow that we had to proceed in single file. That put us at a disadvantage tactically, but what else were we going to do? We were used to hearing voices rattling off something in, say, a language we didn't recognize. Instead, we heard something different that actually got us and made our skin crawl. It sounded like a howling noise, followed by a snarling, and then a yelping or a barking. It sounded nothing like people and everything like animals. The flashlights on our M16s showed us that we were in a courtyard where a dried-up fountain stood in the center. There was a sculpture in the fountain, and it didn't make sense at the time. But looking back, I'm chilled by the memory even further. It was a woman, with the head of a dog. We had no idea that it was a bit of foreshadowing of what was to come. We soon saw movement. Bodies were crawling down over walls and leaping from windows into the courtyard with us. We were too tactically engaged to notice they weren't human. Bear-sized bodies with the shapes of drooling, snarling wolves became more and more evident. It was like a badly written sequel to Teen Wolf, with unlimited stunt doubles. The mission parameters instantly narrowed to preserving the detachment. We opened fire on the monsters, and they didn't exactly melt at the touch of live ammunition. They did eventually die, but it was more like they were succumbing to bee stings than bullets. They were able to absorb a ridiculous amount of gunfire before they refused to move anymore. It's rumored that the Iraq War might have ended sooner if we hadn't been pushed back so hard. But in this instance, these weren't terrorists. These were animals, and they were unusually tough. The reports connected to that mission were never released, especially publicly. The U.S. would never gracefully accept a report that her troops were pushed back by wild animals during a key mission. Most of our internal commanders didn't accept it either. Anyway, that's my story. So there you go. There's the story that I had him tell me and write down and send to me. I know the guy personally. Very honest, hardworking, has done multiple tours over to Iraq. I don't know the exact number, but I'm pretty sure it's like 3, 4, or maybe 5. He's got his experience. Anyway, I hope this is at least interesting. Have a good day. Hi, my name's Roy, and I have a story to tell you from my childhood. So, I grew up with an older brother. At the time of this story, I was 7 and he was 9. We used to play all the time in the spring and summer in a very large patch of woods directly behind our house. We spent hours and hours back there playing together, playing swords with sticks, building tree forts, pretending to start fires, cops and robbers, you name it. We spent hours exploring, looking at bugs, trying to find buried treasure, like any kids do. You know, all the stuff We tried to spend the majority of our free time outside when we could, mainly because inside offered us no entertainment. My parents didn't have any TVs, no game systems, nothing. We had a few books here and there, but nothing my brother and I were interested in. So we try and spend all of our time outside and live like real kids do. But that changed halfway during a summer when I was 7 and he was 9. We were out playing, and I remember we had a game of hide-and-go-seek. Well, I was it, and so I counted to 50. This time, before I could even finish counting, he comes back running, screaming all the way back to the house. It completely caught me off guard and by surprise. Then, I thought he was pranking me or trying to joke with me, and so I laughed and ran after him. But he was just bawling hysterically, crying, screaming, running to the back door. I chased after him and tried to get him to slow down, but he didn't. He didn't even acknowledge me. He was in a total state of shock and fear. When he got to the back door, I finally caught up with him. My mother was busy doing something, so it took her a minute, if not more, to get to the back door. She usually kept it locked. I had never seen my brother in my life so overtaken by a pure raw emotion as that is fear. It wasn't until a little later, even my mom was freaked out, that she was able to fully get him calmed down. But it was days before he would tell any of us what exactly happened. He just kind of said he saw something, but we really couldn't get anything out of him. Then, days after that, he told me what it is that he saw. It had been about a week, and he asked me if I could keep a secret, and I told him yes. Even more so, being only 7 years of age, you want to do anything to be by your brother, and him and I are very close, still. So he told me that he saw a real-life werewolf as he ran to hide. It was walking up to him from behind the tree, reaching out to grab him, from what he said. He said it was big and hairy, covered in dark black fur, with huge fangs and large eyes and ears. It scared him so bad that he ran away. He was pretty serious about it too. He was very shaken up about it, retelling the story at 9 years of age. Plus, he had no desire to go back and play in the woods for the rest of the year, which was a huge loss for both of us. So we just kind of stayed inside and were bored the rest of the summer. Now that we're older, and both in our later 20s, I'll ask him about it sometimes. And he basically just tells me what I told you already, that he believes he saw some sort of creature that resembled the werewolves. He's pretty firm on his belief that vampires, mummies, werewolves, those don't exist. But there can be animals out there that have the same resemblance as made-up Hollywood creatures. I mean, that's a lot more plausible than the idea of an actual werewolf existing. So, as he went on to describe it to the T, basically said exactly what he did when he was 9. It stood up on 2 legs, covered in dark black fur. He said it was really thick, kind of like a shaggy dog, long and gangly, and very unkempt, like it had been rolling around in dirt and filth and muck. And he said its face was somewhere of a cross between a German shepherd and a wolf, a very pronounced brow ridge, kind of like some monkeys do, and very, very long ears that were very pointed, and a long muzzle, and huge, sharp canines. This thing was walking towards him, extending both of its arms, like it was going to grab him, but it made no effort to run after him or move any faster than a casual slow pace, even after he started running. The whole thing is weird, he tells me, but it is what it is. The following spring and summer, we continued to play back in those woods, and never had any problems afterwards. We moved out of that house and all the way across town when we were 15 and 13, right around high school age. Anyway, that's my story, or I should say my brother's story. I never saw or heard or seen anything. I was forcing myself to go camping because I was out of shape at the time, and I knew that if I did not develop a taste for fresh air and something like exercise, I was going to have a miserable last stretch of my existence. I'm also kind of a hypochondriac, and I'm only 36. Several of my friends got a camping trip together for old time's sake. Old times that I were never part of because I was far too afraid of the outdoors. So, I went along. It didn't do too bad, except I couldn't stand to be far away from anyone for too long. There was something about being by myself outdoors that made me feel exposed and uncomfortable. I think my friends took turns pawning me off onto each other, as if they were some collective group of babysitters. I had a breakthrough when I was moved to stand and stare at a pond that we discovered at the campsite. For a moment, I forgot about being afraid, and I forgot about being alone. Bad part was, when I finally started paying attention to what was around me, I found that I was alone. That's when the first wave of panic hit me. I frantically looked around for somebody, anybody that would be nearby. I heard some movement in a nearby cluster of trees, and I was pretty sure that my friends couldn't have gone very far. Nor did I think it likely that they would deliberately abandon me, considering my mental state. I didn't stop to think about the possibility that it could be somebody that I didn't know, or a bear, or worse. It was worse. It turned around in time to look at me, and I think for a half second, we both wore the same expression of confusion. This thing walked on two legs, but was no human being. It looked down at me from a very thick bear-like neck and head that was plunged onto hunched, huge shoulders. The face resembled somebody trying to crossbreed a dog with a pig. Some of its teeth protruded like tusks, but it had the black nose and a smashed face of a hog. The ears were weird as well. They were very long and very rough-looking, like they were torn apart. I'm sorry, that probably doesn't make any sense. They were kind of gross. I picked a random direction, and I just ran. I thought it was running behind me, but I couldn't tell the sounds of my footsteps from it. My friend has no trouble finding me, as much as the screaming as I was doing. They say that I was screaming something about a giant dog. Evidently, they didn't see what had been behind me. I asked them about it, and none of them saw anything. Perhaps the thing was just as startled by me as I was of it. But I know nothing of what I saw. I'm merely only guessing. And I thought it would be best if I reached out to you, since you seem to have answers and know exactly what these people deal with. Based on the descriptions that I gave you, what is it that you think I saw? I was just a kid myself. The first time my little sister told me about her pet. We all presumed it was just some imaginary playmate that she had created, since we weren't allowed pets in the apartment complex. She talked for hours about Doggy and how she only saw him at nighttime, and that he was her special friend. She took it quite far as well, starting to sneak bits of food out of the fridge or save bits of her supper to take out to him. We lived in a second-floor apartment, and although she wasn't allowed to go down into a shared yard where it was dark, our mom had a small balcony from her bedroom, so she'd go there to see Doggy and give him his treat. Sometimes I'd ask if I could come see him too, and she'd shake her head no. Doggy won't come if he sees anybody else, she'd tell me. So serious and solemnly, it was almost compelling. This went on for years. Sometimes, there would be a complaint about some dirt having been kicked up in the yard or the trash cans knocked over. One time, there were even scratch marks on the outside of the balcony, and again, Doggy got the blame. In the end, I had to know. I knew there couldn't be any way in hell that my little sister actually had a dog that only manifested at nighttime and was somehow big enough to reach our second-floor balcony. It was absolutely 100% impossible. I also knew that she wouldn't let me go and see Doggy, so I'd just have to sneak. So that evening, after supper, I clutched my belly and said I needed a visit to the bathroom. I might be a while. I remember seeing her pocket a sausage from her plate, so I knew she was going straight out whilst Mom cleared dishes. I shot out of the room, but instead of the bathroom, I raced into my mom's bedroom and hid in the closet. Then I waited. Sure enough, moments after, I heard her come in and slide open the balcony door. Then I heard her. As quietly as I could, I opened the door. I remember thinking at that point, my sister should get into performance art, as the panting and snuffling noises coming from the balcony sounded very realistic. Then, I saw it. Doggy. I don't know how tall it was, whether it was standing on something or strong enough to have climbed up and to hang onto the railing, but I could clearly see its face in the shadows, thanks to the security light. It was definitely some kind of dog, but unlike anything I had ever seen. It was slightly obscured by the railings, but I can make out that it was eating the leftover sausage with one of its hands, because this dog had long arms and hands kind of like a person, but a definite dog head and face, and had yellow, dull glowing eyes. Staring at my sister, I was frozen in terror. This dog thing looked like something that had been released straight from hell. Yet she didn't seem one bit afraid. She had reached through the railing and even tried to pat it. It honestly could have killed her in an instant. I could see the veins and muscles throbbing through its giant hair, but instead looked at her. Leaning over the railing, she said bye to her pet and said see you later. And just like that, she walked back out of our mom's room, not noticing me. I waited for another moment, and then, overcoming my fear, I tiptoed out of the balcony and peered over the railings. I heard a low growl that made my stomach turn to water, and I could tell you that I really did need the bathroom then. The next evening after supper, she came back to the table after going out to see this thing, what she called Doggy, with a look of disappointment. He wasn't there. Mom had ruffled her hair and said not to worry, but he never came back. Whether it was a coincidence or whether that growl was a message, that he'd been betrayed or something, I don't know. But we never had another visit, and my sister never talked about it again. I've even tried to get her to mention it, and she somehow knows no idea what I'm talking about. But I know what I saw. Sometimes I have to remind myself that monsters are indeed real. I feel like I'm living in a Goosebumps book sometimes. I think the only reason that this creature was even coming around was basically because my sister was feeding it, and quite well. She would bring a lot of food out there. It wasn't just like scraps or half a sandwich. It was a lot. This thing never acted friendly in a traditional pet sense, but it did act neutral. Again, if you're offering something a food source, it makes sense that it's going to lure it in. I'm just surprised it didn't take her, for whatever reason. A few months ago, I decided to do some urban exploring. It's something that I had been really interested in for a while. but just hadn't gotten around to actually doing anything about it. I'd gotten as far as buying a kit for it and doing the investigation. You know, surveying a spot, checking for security. I just hadn't had the right prerequisite kick up the butt to get up and actually doing it. Then, I had a massive fight with my then girlfriend, in which not only did she dump me, but was also quite cutting in her remarks. That was my catalyst. So, off I went. Only things didn't quite turn out as planned, as they never do. Being a bit of a horror buff, one of the criteria was when I was selecting the location of my first urbex was the likelihood of it being haunted. The prospect of actually seeing a ghost and catching it on camera, and then of course, putting it on a specially created YouTube channel in which it goes viral and makes me famous, would be just what I needed to shove in my ex's face. So, an abandoned school seemed so ripe for the potential for creepy ghost kids. Plus, there was some urban legend attached that suggested the old headmaster had hung himself, which is why it was now derelict. I couldn't find anything to validate that, but it was good enough to go on. Man, I was psyched. I really wanted to see something. And they do say that you can will stuff to appear if you believe. That apparitions are far more likely to manifest to a believer. So, I was armed with a camera that had a decent night vision mode, and off I went. Now, it is all very well planning these things. You can read about it. You can hear people talking about it. You can even see it on various websites. But actually, being there in the middle of the night, all on your own, is quite different. And I'm not afraid to admit that it was certainly unnerving at the very least. Yes, I was excited, but I was also bricking it. I could feel malevolence oozing from every corner, but I forced myself to keep going and not turn around and flee, like some sort of chicken. Further in I went. I'm not exaggerating to say it, that it absolutely stank in there, like wet dog and years of mud. But it smelled like every local animal that had used it as a toilet, especially dog urine, especially. I had to keep the light pointed at the floor most of the time, just to avoid piles of fecal matter. And it was rank. I'd just go about into the furthest accessible point when I heard a growl. This is in England, by the way. We don't have wolves, or bears, or mountain lions. There's not a lot of animal life that can really hurt you, especially if you're a full-grown man. At most, it might be a fox who, although I wouldn't want to nip me, would likely be frightened off by the light right in its furry little face. Then I heard it again. I've never actually heard a fox growl. I've seen them sniffling around the bins, and I know that a vixen makes a god-awful racket when she's in season. But I have yet to hear anything growl like this. Your mind does crazy things when you're on hyper alert, and I started to question the last time there had been a wolf sighting in the southwest of England, despite knowing it had likely been well over 100 years. Telling myself that it had to be some sort of dog that had run away from home and was probably threatened, thinking I was challenging him for the rat supply. I shone my light over in the general direction of the noise, and I kid you not, I very nearly added to those piles of crap all over the ground. Over in the corner, what at first I thought might have been a werewolf. That was honestly the first thing my mind went to. But since it wasn't racing at me, with its claws and jaws out, ready to eviscerate me, I inferred that it wasn't going to kill me. Just yet anyway. And that reasoning allowed me just a little bravery, or stupidity, whichever you feel is most applicable, and I took a second look. This thing was huge. It was taller than I, and definitely more broad. It looked to be made of pure muscle, except I could quite see it as covered in dark matted fur. It had long legs and arms just like a person, which had made me originally jump to the werewolf theory. But getting a second look, I could see the head was not wolf-like, although it had been an easy mistake to make when it's dark. It was more like a dog, kind of like a German shepherd. And that is when it really sank in. Even if this wasn't about to be Dog Soldiers Part 2, there was still a frickin' massive dog person in the same room as I was. That's when it let out a low, guttural growl, and that was enough for me. I legged it, ran as fast as I could. I didn't give a crap about filming or documenting anything. I just wanted to make it out alive. I have no real idea exactly what I saw down there. I went in hoping to see orbs, or feel cold, or something spooky. But whatever the hell that was, whatever creature that was, it wasn't a ghost or supernatural. It was very real, and I will never be returning to that spot. I have no answers for what animal I've witnessed that night. I have you for what I think is a Dogman story, although we are still not 100% sure. I'll tell you my story anyway, and let you decide for yourself what you think, since you seem to be an expert on the topic. It actually even sounds like some sort of urban legend as I tell it, but I promise you, this is true. My boyfriend and I both come from fairly religious backgrounds, with very strict parents, and even stricter rules about being in the house together. Doors open at all times kind of stuff, which is all well and good, as we respect our family. But when you're 17 and want to be together, you need to be inventive. So it was back to old-fashioned parking, finding a secluded lane somewhere we wouldn't get busted by anybody, nosy neighbors, cops, so we could enjoy ourselves in peace. We were both into scary stuff, and had even joked about the Texarkana stuff, where the hookman decided to prey on the Lover's Lane couples. I hope the hookman doesn't come, we'd be joking before getting the windows hot. Then one night, something happened. Only this time, the thing that came didn't have a hook. We found what we had thought was a perfect spot to be alone. An old country road, surrounded by thick woodland that didn't really seem to go anywhere. It was unlikely anybody would use it, unless they actually wanted to park up here. We'd been coming up here for a couple of weeks, and so far, the only slight interruption we'd had was barking, which we assumed was coming from one of the nearby farms, which were far for us, but close enough that on a still night, you could hear them. A few times they seemed to be really going mad. There was so much barking, it almost put us off. This time, however, the barking and now growling seemed a hell of a lot closer than normal. Of course, even though I mentioned this, my boyfriend was adamant that no dog was going to stop us. He even seemed a little jumpy when we had heard a bark that must have come from the woods not as far from the farm, but he was still insistent. Even if there was a dog running around in the trees, it wasn't going to do nothing to us. Well, I wish I'd have the good sense to listen to my own senses, as lo and behold, just a few moments after that barking that already sounded way too close for comfort, came growling. A low, intense, and way too close for the car growling, followed swiftly by a scratching noise on the side of the vehicle. I was beginning to scream. I honest to God thought that the actual real hookman was out there, and he was going to rip open the car and gut us. What else would be making that noise? My boyfriend began panicking and did the only thing he could think of in the moment. he turned the headlight on full beam and hit the horn. I don't know if it was the sudden shock of the light, the sudden blast of the horn, or both, but the thing outside that was making the growling and scratching noises froze outside of the driver's side window for just a second, but that was long enough for us to see what it was. It was as tall as the car and broad like a wrestler, covered in hair. It stood up on two legs like a person and was really hairy. This wasn't a person though. It very clearly had an animal head. A dog had to be precise. It kind of reminded me of one of those dogs from the canine units the police use. I don't know what breed of dog it is. He looked right at us through the window and turned around and casually left. When I say he took off, I mean he was there 1 second and gone in the next. It was like he's faster than any Olympic runner. My boyfriend quickly jumped in the seat and hit the gas, and we were out of there, still barely clothed. He called me the following morning to say he'd been out to check the side of his car, just to see what damage there was now that it was daylight. He said in the side of his car were 4 real deep indented scratches, looking like a damn bear or wolf had tried to gouge out the panel. I still don't know exactly what we saw. Parts of me want to think it was some kind of hellhound sent us to stop from fornicating, but that's just my religious upbringing. The rational side of me has honestly no clue. I saw it close enough that I can confirm it was for sure not somebody in some costume, but the side that spent hours driving down the YouTube wormhole makes me think it might have been something more evil. I work in security in this very well-to-do neighborhood. It's a pretty good gig, but to be honest, not a lot happens. And although the houses are large, and no doubt full of valuables, any would-be burglar would have been crazy to attempt a break-in. These rich people got top-of-the-line CCTV, motion lights, alarms. They're inside. Some probably armed to the teeth, rigged up to 911. So most of the time, I just drive around, waving at people and checking that delivery drivers move off quickly. Then, one night, I get a call from one of my favorites, saying her backyard light keeps coming on, and there looks to be a strange dog trying to get in the house. She had chihuahuas, I guess, and I'm guessing whatever was sniffing around outside the fence knew that. She instructed to bring a big gun and told me it's a big dog. I'm not really afraid of dogs. I always fancied a detail with a canine unit, but I ain't stupid. I might not be afraid, but that don't mean I'm gonna head over there with the intentions of petting this thing. Huge dogs did not sound like something I wanted to be around more than I had to. So, I wandered on over, big gun and big flashlight in hand. I sneak around to the back of the property where she said she could see the creature or dog via the security light. I whistled, calling it over, and hoping it wasn't actually that big, that it would just be some dog I could take to the pound and get on with my night. Maybe it was one of the neighbors' loose dogs. I could hear some rustling and a growl. Not the best sign. I pulled out some sausages and still trying with a flashlight. Then my eyes saw this thing for what it was. The lady had been correct when she said this was a big dog. It was nearly larger than me. Not really taller, but skinny and very mangy looking. It also stood upright, like a person, panting, with very heavy labored breathing. Its head and face very much so reminded me of a jackal. I yelled, grabbed the gun, intending to shoot it when it ran. I've never seen anything move that fast before. I gave a little chase, but I couldn't even tell in which direction it had gone. I spent the whole night looking, trying to figure out what it was. Anyway, that's my latest and greatest encounter. I was playing Nerf guns with my older brother back when I was a little kid. I was far too little at the time to know that he wasn't coming to get me when I was hiding behind a rock for too long. He was using it as a chance to get rid of me so he could go back to playing video games, tricking me into playing Nerf wars with him, waiting for me to hide, and shooting at me just enough so I would. And then as I waited for him, one turn, I went deeper into the woods behind our house and waited even more for him to show himself. I must have been one of those children with superhuman patience, because I sat there waiting until the sun was starting to go down. Only then did I get it through my thick skull that he wasn't coming, and I needed to get home. My path was intercepted by an animal that was walking on 2 legs instead of 4. This scared me. It wasn't looking at me, but it was sniffing the air every few steps it took. Looking back, it had an exaggerated oversized head with the general features of a Doberman pinscher. That is, if the fur were more wild and the markings less distinct. It was all teeth and claws, and I thought better of distracting it. I told my brother about it when I got home, of course, after chastising him for not coming home after me. He turned pale at the word of the story, but nobody else really believed me. He did, though. I wondered about that for a very long time. He did confess later on, much later when I was older, that he had run across the same towering dog-like beast. When he heard that I had encountered it, he was hit by a pang of guilt and thought it was incredibly fortunate that I was still alive. I've done my own homework now that I'm older, and apparently, it's not unusual for this humanoid dog to spare the lives of humans. Still, it's a chance I'd rather not take.